Egypt, 2,000 years ago. The sun beats down on the Nile's fertile banks. Papyrus rustles in the wind. You are a young woman, newly married, and your belly carries the promise of life. But in ancient Egypt, pregnancy was not just a private matter. It was a ritual,
Un spectacle.
and sometimes, a terrifying ordeal. Midwives, priests, and even temple officials gather around. They do not speak gently. They chant, observe, and perform actions you do not understand. Every movement has meaning. Every ritual has consequences. Some say these practices ensured the health of mother and child. Others whisper darker truths, that the rituals were designed to control, test, or even punish women. You feel the tension in the air. Candles flicker. Incense smoke curls toward the ceiling. Your hands are examined. Your pulse measured. Ancient spells are recited, each syllable heavy with intent. This was the world of ancient Egyptian pregnancy, where magic and medicine intertwined, where spiritual belief dictated physical care, and where women were both revered and fearfully manipulated. Historians have recorded fragments, spells written on papyrus, objects buried near beds, depictions on temple walls. But few understand the full horror, the full devotion, and the full mystery of these rituals. By the end of this story, you will see a side of ancient Egypt rarely spoken of. A side where life begins with awe, and sometimes with terror. In ancient Egypt, pregnancy was never just personal. It was public, ritualized, and heavily supervised. From the moment a woman was suspected to be pregnant, midwives and temple attendants began their careful monitoring. They did not rely solely on medicine. They relied on omens, spells, and sacred objects. Herbs were crushed and smelled, water divined, linen swaddles ritually placed near the womb. Every detail mattered. Some tests seem benign at first glance. A woman might be asked to urinate on a barley and wheat mixture. The growth of the seeds would reveal the child's sex. Other procedures, however, were far darker. Women were observed for signs of danger, subjected to physical examinations that were invasive, even frightening. Certain substances, meant to ensure fertility or prevent miscarriage, were toxic if misused. Priests invoked gods like Bes and Tauret, performing chants and incantations while physically manipulating the mother's body. Candles, amulets, and sacred oil surrounded her, each with a spiritual purpose, but each also a subtle tool of control, reminding the mother that the fate of her child was not entirely in her hands. Failure to comply with the rituals could bring shame, social ostracism, or worse. In a society where divine favor and earthly survival were intertwined, every ritual was both a blessing and a test, a delicate balance between protection and terror. Pregnancy in ancient Egypt was a world of mystery, awe, and a hidden, unsettling tension. Once a pregnancy was confirmed, the rituals intensified. Ancient Egyptian women were subjected to a combination of physical procedures, protective spells, and purification rites that could be both fascinating and terrifying. Midwives applied herbal poultices to the belly, some soothing, others harsh. Certain treatments were believed to strengthen the womb, but miscalculations could cause pain or illness. Women were also required to carry amulets shaped like gods, animals, or sacred symbols. Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess, was often depicted to protect both mother and child. But it wasn't just about protection. Some rituals were designed to test a woman's endurance and purity. She might be placed in a confined, smoke-filled chamber, surrounded by chanting priests, her movements restricted while sacred oils were applied. Every discomfort, every tremor, was interpreted as a sign, sometimes of divine favor, sometimes of spiritual danger. Priests and midwives also performed spells directly on the body, sometimes inserting small objects into garments or even under the skin to ward off evil spirits. Failure to follow these rituals exactly could bring blame to the mother for any misfortune that befell the child, creating an immense psychological burden. Pregnancy in ancient Egypt was never solely about biology. It was a performance of faith, obedience, and endurance, where the mother's body became both a temple and a testing ground. Every ritual carried the weight of centuries of tradition, divine expectation, and the fragile line between life and death. Labor in ancient Egypt was as much a spiritual ordeal as a physical one. The moment a woman went into labor, midwives and priests descended with urgency, preparing protective charms, sacred oils, and incantations. The birth was a ritual as old as the temples themselves. The mother was often positioned on special birthing bricks, elevated stones that allowed midwives to guide delivery while performing sacred chants. Priests invoked gods like Bes to ward off demons, while amulets were pressed against the mother's body to shield both her and the unborn child. But the rituals were not always gentle. Some practices involved applying intense pressure to the belly, or using herbs that induced contractions but could cause extreme pain. Women were expected to endure these tests without complaint, as resistance was interpreted as weakness or spiritual impurity. The psychological pressure was immense. Every movement, every cry, was scrutinized. Midwives whispered instructions and spells, correcting any deviation from the sacred procedure. Failure to comply could bring social shame, suspicion of curses, or accusations that the mother had angered the gods. When the child was finally delivered, purification rites followed immediately. The newborn was wrapped in linen, blessed, and sometimes anointed with oils or placed near sacred objects for protection. Even then, the rituals continued for days, ensuring that mother and child were spiritually fortified against unseen dangers. Birth in ancient Egypt was not only the arrival of new life, it was a battle of endurance, faith, and survival, where every ritual demanded obedience and courage, and failure could have consequences far beyond the physical realm. Once the newborn was cradled in linen and blessed with sacred oils, the rituals did not end. Ancient Egyptian society believed that both mother and child remained vulnerable for months, even years. Amulets were placed at the home, spells inscribed on papyrus, and protective charms hung over doorways. But beneath the reverence lay a darker reality. Many of the rituals, herbal treatments, confinement, and physical tests, were painful, sometimes dangerous, and often driven by superstition rather than medicine. Mistakes or misinterpretations could harm both mother and child. The very traditions meant to safeguard life could also threaten it. Priests and midwives wielded extraordinary control. The rituals demanded obedience and compliance, enforcing social hierarchies and spiritual authority over women's bodies. Those who defied the rituals or failed in the eyes of the gods risked public shame or even accusations of bringing misfortune to their family. Yet these practices endured for centuries, leaving traces on temple walls, ancient texts, and burial artifacts. Scholars today piece together fragments, revealing a culture where pregnancy was a mix of divine expectation, human ingenuity, and fear. The story of these rituals reminds us that ancient life was never simply about survival. It was a complex interplay of belief, control, and endurance. Women were revered as life-bearers, yet their pregnancies were scrutinized, manipulated, and tested in ways that were both sacred and profoundly disturbing. Ancient Egyptian pregnancy rituals were a testament to a society obsessed with life, death, and the delicate line in between, a world where the creation of life was inseparable from awe, pain, and terror. Not all pregnancy rituals in ancient Egypt were publicly known. Some were whispered secrets, practiced in shadowed chambers and hidden temple corridors. These rites were reserved for women of influence, nobles, priestesses, or those whose offspring were believed to hold great spiritual or political significance. Some involved extreme purification ceremonies, where women were isolated for days, subjected to smoke, chanting, and fasting. Certain herbs, intended to ensure a strong child or ease labor, were toxic if misused, causing illness or miscarriage. In some cases, symbolic sacrifices were made, offerings of food, amulets, or even small figurines placed near the mother to transfer danger away from her body. The psychological toll was enormous. Women were expected to internalize the fear of divine punishment, obeying every ritual to the letter. Any error, perceived or real, could mark them as impure or unlucky. Midwives and temple officials became both protectors and enforcers, wielding authority over life and death with ritual precision. Art and hieroglyphs suggest that some rites involved intimate contact under the guise of protection, where spiritual and physical boundaries blurred. Only fragments of these practices remain, leaving historians to piece together the full scope of what was done behind closed doors. These hidden rituals reveal a society where pregnancy was not only sacred, but controlled, monitored, and manipulated, where the line between care and coercion was perilously thin. In ancient Egypt, the creation of life could be both a blessing and a trial, a test of endurance, obedience, and spiritual strength. After birth, The rituals did not end. New mothers remained under scrutiny for weeks, sometimes months, until both they and their children were deemed safe from the wrath of the gods. Amulets were sewn into clothing, protective spells were recited daily, and midwives made frequent visits to ensure compliance with sacred instructions. Even then, danger lingered. Infants were highly vulnerable, and any illness could be interpreted as a spiritual failing, not a medical issue. The mother bore the weight of responsibility, often carrying blame and guilt for events beyond her control. Social and religious pressures created a culture of fear where survival was tied as much to obedience and ritual as to nourishment and care. These practices left deep marks on Egyptian society. Hieroglyphs, papyri, and temple art reveal a civilization obsessed with controlling the forces of life, death, and fate. Pregnancy was not a natural process alone. It was a performance of faith, endurance, and ritual mastery, where the physical, psychological, and spiritual were inseparably intertwined. The most disturbing element is how ordinary fear was ritualized. What began as devotion to gods often blurred into control, manipulation, and suffering. Women endured the full weight of societal and spiritual expectation, and their bodies became both sacred vessels and sites of trial. The legacy of these rituals reminds us that in ancient Egypt, life's creation was never simple or private. It was monitored, managed, and, at times, terrifying, a reflection of a culture where reverence and fear coexisted in every heartbeat of the unborn and the living alike.